this week's Preppin data is a great one for all you football fans out there. We've got data about all of the games that Liverpool have played, and we're interested in doing some analysis on who's part of their team each week, or each game, sorry. So you'll notice that we've got the cleaned with data interpreter checked here. Let's just bring in an example of what it looked like before. If I uncheck that, it's going to break everything up there. Now you can see that we've got horrible headers and everything's all out of line. So that's not helpful at all. So let's get rid of that again. Click the use data interpreter, and now we get nice headers that kind of explain what each of our sections is about instead. So the first few fields are all related to the match details, then we go on to the starting 11, etc., and so forth. So that's a lot easier to see and understand what all the data is. So that's the first thing that we need to make sure we have done for this challenge. But now it's a bit annoying, the match details being in front of every single field name, because we know that a date field is just going to mean the date. So we're going to do some pivoting to get rid of this. So if we pivot on anything that starts with match, and then we can clean it using the best way I find to do this is when we've got our field name here, then we just go and do an automatic split, and it knows that basically you want to get rid of anything that's repeated all the way down the field. And that's great. That leaves us with our headers that we like. We don't really need to do any more renaming or anything because we're just going to pivot it back anyway. So make sure that when we're aggregating this back up, we're maxing it because it goes to count by default, and that's not very useful. And we know there's only going to be one value because we're basically just redoing that pivot anyway. So that's fine. So from here, we're going to split off into two separate streams. We've got these subs, which is dealing with all the different substitutions that happen in the match, and then we've got all of our players who are either in the starting 11 or they're a substitute. So we'll talk through those first. So we're using the wildcard to help us out with these 11 fields that we have for the starting 11, and then we're just dragging in the substitutes as well, so that they all go into one column. And then we're just going to do a bit of cleanup. So we start from here, and we're just splitting off the field here into starting 11 or substitutes, and then the number of that player during that match, because that helps us to join onto the substitutes later on. And then we're just doing some renaming of fields and getting rid of anything unnecessary that's related to the substitutions. So for the substitutions, then we're doing another pivot. Lots of pivots in this week's Preppin data. We're choosing any of the fields that start with sub, and this avoids the substitutes because that starts with a capital S. Our one starts with lowercase s, and that's actually quite useful that it only picks up those in lowercase. So that's a good use of the wildcard being case sensitive. Usually it just annoys me, but today that was really good. So we've got those all down, and we know that basically when we split off what we want to split off, we want either there to be no number there to be a 1, or there to be a 2. So when we've split that off, then we get these two fields, and we know that we need to do some renaming. So we know that our, one of them refers to on, a player coming on, one of them refers to the player coming off, and one of them refers to the substitution time. So we just manually click in here and rename them, which is nice and easy. You could have written a calculator field to do the same thing, but I thought that was the easiest way. And then to get this to be the order of the substitutions, we just simply click here and say remove the letters, and then that gives us our numbers. So that's helpful as well. And then we are getting rid of these nulls here as well, because this is where a match may not have had 3 substitutions. In this data set there are up to 3 substitutions, but there may not have been 3 substitutions every match. So we just filter those out, and that's all for that step. Now we're going to repivot this data. So we basically want these to be the new headers, and these will still be our values. So then we'll basically have a row for each substitution for each match. So we pivot that again, and remember our max again. And now we this is the data that we have once we've removed all those fields, because now we're going to want to join it back on. We're going to use the date to join it back on, because each match, that's quite a unique thing about a match, the date that it happens on. There will never be more than one match in a day. So if we join those on, then we can get our player names basically for the ons and the offs. So we can start linking these two streams back together. So if we go here, then if we're joining on the date first, because again, that's our unique thing to find each match. And then we're going to join our off, which has the number, to our player column, which has the player number. And that gives us, initially if we were only doing a inner join, then we would be excluding all the players that weren't involved in any in being substituted off. That wouldn't be very useful. We want all of our players, so we're going to be doing a right join because all of our players' data is on the right in this case. So if we just do that for our off, and then we basically are just going to change this bit here to be for our players that we're substituting on, then we'll have these 522 rows in both, where we've got our on or off substitutions. Just going to do a little calculated field here. These are all the players that have been substituted on at some point. So we're saying that, where our on column is null, remain null. But otherwise, rather than having it as being a player number, we want to know just that it's the player is being substituted on. It's just a stylistic way of changing how the data is, makes it easier to interpret. And we're doing that the same up here as well. We're adding a column on that says on or off, and it just says off or null for those players that haven't been substituted off, and then we're just unioning those together. Now this will obviously mean that we are duplicating rows because we're just sticking two lots of 500-ish rows together. So we'll probably have some duplicates in there. For example, we'll have where a player has started the match, there'll be one row where it's null, and then they're going to go off, and there'll be a separate row for that. So what we need to do is some aggregation, where mostly we're grouping by all of our fields, but then for all of these where it's related to being substituted on or off, or the substitute time, or the substitute order that they were substituted in, that's when we need to take a maximum value there, so that rather than it being a null, it'll take either the on or the off, etc. and so forth. It's basically where we had the more rows coming through here, where we had a row for each game and then a row for each substitution that happened in that game. That's where our duplication is coming in, so we just need to be aggregating so that we're back to these 522 rows, which is each match and each player in each match. So now we've got a row for each player and each match that they played. So that's great. We can actually calculate now one of our first metrics that we were asked for in this challenge, and that was how many times has a player appeared in a squad. So if we group by a player here, let me just add on an aggregate because Tableau Prep has a strange issue at the moment. But I'll show you what I mean. So we're grouping by the starting 16, and then we're summing the number of rows, basically. So how many times were they in the squad? Up here, I've renamed this aggregation of the number of rows to be in squad, but as soon as I do that, it disappears from my ability to see it in the aggregated fields, but you can see that I've done it in the changes. So nothing to worry about. It's just a little bug, but that's where that went. And that answers the first of the questions that was posed by this challenge. So that's good. But then for now we're only interested in the games that players have actually been involved in. So we want to filter out all of those players who were substitutes and never actually got on the pitch. So that's in the interest of calculating our appearances metric. So this filter, a little bit complicated, but it's saying if the player started off as a substitute, so they weren't on the pitch at the start of the match, and if the on-off column is null, so they never went onto the pitch, then we don't want them. For that match, we don't care about them. So we're saying false, get rid of them, filter them out. Otherwise, anyone else was involved in the match in some way, so keep them. And so that brings us down to 400-ish rows. And then we're just going to calculate the playtime. So the playtime, pretty simple. If you're in the starting 11 and you didn't go on or off the pitch, then you played the full 90 minutes. If you were in the starting 11, and by default this kind of means that the rows that are going to this next step, that means they would have been substituted off, then they played up until the time they were substituted. So that's easy. And then otherwise all other players started as substitutes, came on at some point, so they played for 90 minutes minus the time that they were substituted on. So a player that came on in the 80th minute will have played 10 minutes. Not tricky maths there. And then we're going to duplicate this field because we want to work out not only the average time that they played, but we also want to know the total time that they've played during this data set. So then we're doing our aggregation again. We're grouping by our player names and we're summing this one for playtime. That is the total playtime. And we're averaging this field here as well for our minutes played per match, I think we call it. And then we're joining these two together on our player names. And again, we're doing a right join here because in this case, this is our right field and some players never played at all. So that's why they're potentially going to be unmatched or excluded from this join. So we need it to be a right join to bring through all 29 players. And then we've just got a little bit of cleaning up left to do at the end. Get rid of a few fields. And then where you can see here where these players weren't involved, then we have some nulls. And that kind of looks a bit messy, doesn't it, in our data set? So we change that to be, we just basically say wrap the function around, wrap the field around in a ZN, which means turn those nulls into zeros. And that's our very last step to making the output that we want. So thanks for listening, and I hope that was all useful.